Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video, we're looking at the influences on marketing, so HSC Business Studies, and we're looking at the factors influencing consumer choice. So, when we're thinking about this particular topic, what I like to do is to try and break it down into something that makes a little bit more sense for me. And that the kind of plain English questions I'm thinking about are why do consumers choose certain products? And then what factors influence our buying decisions. So, really looking at it from that marketing perspective. And that the way we break it down is we look at psychological, sociocultural, economic, and government. If I'm trying to remember it, I could use the acronym PEGS in terms of thinking about those specific factors, because those are the ones that you will be expected to know. So let's move on to the first factor. And what we're looking here is in terms of psychological. Let's just make this a little bit closer in. So in terms of the question, why do consumers choose certain products? Our first factor is looking at psychological. And that the way that I like to think about psychological influences is these are influences that exist within an individual. So they're operating internally within the individual. They're sort of the characteristics and preferences that they already have, but they're not necessarily spreading to others. So if you think about it, you can think about the things internally that affect your decisions and the things externally that affect your decisions. Externally is very much looking at the influence of society. So here we're not looking at those external factors. Here we're saying what are the factors that are internal to the individual that are affecting their decisions to choose certain products. So if we move down a little bit further, we can think about a number of specific influences in terms of consumer behavior. So when you're thinking about, okay, so why do consumers choose a certain product? Okay, so they're choosing it because of their internal preferences. And then if we break those internal preferences down, we can go into a few different sort of sub factors. So we can look here at perception. Perception is looking at how do consumers perceive a product. For example, is it high or low quality? Does it meet their perceptions of themselves in terms of that maybe they only buy things that are very high quality, desirable products? So we're thinking about how do consumers think about the product and themselves, and then does that product meet their own perceptions? If yes, they'll buy it. If no, they'll choose something else. Another influence is in terms of motives, and motives are really about reasons. So here we're looking at why would someone buy this product? Is it a base requirement like safety? So in terms of maybe food, water, shelter, or is it something more intangible like approval from others? So if someone is buying something just to meet their basic needs, then they might choose sort of any brand because they're just trying to fulfill that basic requirement. If they're looking at something a bit more sort of higher up in terms of self-actualization, if they're thinking about, well, I want something that will offer prestige to my character, then maybe they're going to be more selective about the product and the brand that they choose. The other thing that can influence people's buying decisions in terms of their internal views are their attitudes. How do they feel about particular goods, services, and brands? Are they positive? Are they negative? Have they had very good experiences or poor experiences in terms of their previous encounters with it? The other thing we can think about is this idea of personality and self-image. So here we're thinking about who is this person, right? What do they do? How do they view themselves? And those kind of things will then affect what products they choose, and particularly what brands will they then select that very much match their internal characteristics. And the other thing, which is this idea about learning, is that when we buy something, we have an experience and then we might change our behavior based on that experience. We are learning. So if there was a good experience, we will buy it again. If it was a poor experience, maybe we will choose another brand. So in terms of marketing, we're thinking about why do consumers buy certain products? here are the specific psychological influences that we will think about. If we move along, we can think about this idea of sociocultural influences, and that sociocultural, if we look at how we would break down this word, we would look at here social plus cultural, and when we're thinking about social, we can think about this idea of society as well, and that if we're trying to characterize this, that we're really saying that these are outside of an individual. So if we think about this very amazingly drawn individual here, what we are saying is we are saying that society is having an influence on this person in terms of what they buy and what brands they choose. It's not internal to the person, it's very much exerted on the individual by those around an individual. So hopefully that makes it clear about how psychological and sociocultural are different. If we think about the specific sociocultural external influences, we're thinking about things like people's social class. For example, how does their socioeconomic status, so their education, occupation, income, affect purchases? And that sometimes it's like pretty expected in terms of that if we have maybe less income, Y is just the symbol for income in economics, then we might buy cheaper goods. Or we might actually find that if we have lower incomes, that someone might buy more expensive goods. That it could work that way in terms of that maybe someone's socioeconomic status is a little bit lower, but they want to present a different kind of image to the people around them. The other thing we can think about is that people's culture and their subculture. So, in terms of how do the values and beliefs around us affect the kind of things that we buy? So, we might think about the impact of saving or materialism in terms of this. We might think about, is there a focus on immediate rewards in the kind of culture versus this kind of being patient and sacrificing now for benefits later? That kind of thing. The other thing we can think about is sort of the family and roles that people play. So, for example, parents versus kids in a family, that will very much affect the types of purchases that are made. You can very clearly understand, I think, that the types of purchases made by parents will differ markedly from those made by their children. And the other thing we can think about reference or peer groups, the people around us. So we could lump it into this term influencers, and we're not just thinking about those on social media, but sort of those influences that are directly around us, maybe our friends and influential people, and then also those typical influences that occupy space on social media. So really here we're looking at why do consumers choose certain products when we think about the external environment. The next factor that affects why consumers choose certain product, that affects consumer choice, is this economic factor. And that what we're thinking here is we're thinking about the effect on consumers, shoppers, and businesses, though the firms that sell the goods and services. And that what we want to do is really simplify it in terms of the boom and bust stages of an economy. So it's not going to be as complicated as the business cycle concept in economics, but it's still very similar. So if we think about it in terms of this amazingly detailed graph that I've shown here, is that on one side we've got output and GDP. And that what we can think about in terms of defining that is the the amount of goods and services produced in an economy. That's what we mean by output or gross domestic product. And then on the bottom here, we've got time. So time passing that way. We start at the point 0 here. So we've got two different points here. We've got boom and we've got a bust or a recession. So if we're thinking about a boom, this is where we've got really high levels of economic growth. That's just what EG stands for. So what we're seeing here is that people are So if we're thinking about it overall, what we've got is when the economy is growing is people are earning more. So what's happening is that there is a greater need for workers in the economy because people want more goods and services because they've got more money. And that in turn will lead to higher wages. So we've got people with more money demanding more goods and services. So then firms need to put on more workers to make more goods and services, which will lead to higher wages. And then overall, we've got greater demand for resources from firms in order to make those extra goods and services. So everything's kind of booming or clicking in the economy. And if we look at this bust or recession perspective, it's really the opposite. That the economy is slowing down, less income, rising unemployment. Let's put some more formal notes around this. So if we go to this slide here, so what we can see is that if we look at the boom situation first, UE here is just an abbreviation for unemployment. So unemployment falls, people earn more income, customers, they're increasingly employed, so more people have got jobs, they're very confident and they're going to increase spending as a result. Firms need more workers and more resources, so part of this is we will see higher wages. And if we think about our perspective in business studies, what would we be saying to a business? We would be saying, now is the time to boost your marketing efforts. Now is the time to try and do everything you can to persuade people to buy your products because they are really in a position to buy more products. If we look at the flip side, the bust or recession, so that things slow down. So unemployment rises, and as a result, less people have jobs, so less people have higher incomes. Customers more are unemployed, they're pessimistic, less confidence. They're going to reduce discretionary spending. What I mean by discretionary spending is spending that they can control, so things that are not sort of essential in terms of like food or rent, those kind of things that the consumer goods they will spend less on. Firms need less workers, less resources. We're likely to see lower wages at this point as well. If we're being asked what advice would you give a business in terms of marketing, is that you should do everything you can to survive during this tough situation. So try and reduce your expenses, including marketing. So now in a bust or recession is not the time to really try and launch significant marketing campaigns. It's just not the most appropriate setting because people aren't in a position to buy extra goods and services. If we move on in terms of our next and our last factor influencing consumer choice in terms of the government, is that we can really think about government influences in two ways. So we can look at economic policies, and we'll put that in orange, and then we'll put regulation, and we'll put that in pink. So if we look at, let's just get rid of that. If you look at economic policies first, is what we're saying is that In its day-to-day work, the government will create policies that will encourage or discourage economic growth. They will spend money in a particular area that will then increase demand for resources in that area that will then boost economic activity, or they will tax an area or remove resources from another area that will then affect economic activity. So what we're saying is that economic policies, which are enacted by government, put in place by government, will expand or contract economic activity, which will affect consumers and businesses. One example that's sort of relevant in 2022 is you can think about the lockdowns that were put in place by governments to stop the spread of COVID. That if the government locks down an economy, businesses cannot trade, which means sales will fall, unemployment will rise, that kind of thing. And it is a policy that is created by government. The other thing you can think about that might have a similar thing is that if the government chooses to increase tax in a particular area, that will also slow down economic activity there. If we think about regulation, regulation is sort of just another word for kind of the policies or laws that are put in place around a particular area. So, for example, the government might say, well, we want to restrict marketing activities in particular areas, and that if you do the wrong thing, we will impose fines on you here. For example, if you think about cigarettes, that the government has restricted marketing activities very heavily in the sense that brands cannot advertise at all, and that they can't even have images and things on their packaging in terms of selling them, so that the government is restricting their ability to market things there, which will then restrict the ability of consumers to see it and maybe to be persuaded to buy them as well. So the government has an influence in terms of these two elements. They can set economic policies that will affect economic activity, which will then affect the ability of consumers and businesses to choose products. And they can also impose regulation, which will then restrict the ability of firms to market and restrict the ability of consumers to actually understand and know about the product and be persuaded to purchase it. So if we just remind ourselves a little bit, come back to, there we go. If we just come back to here, so that what we've really looked at is the factors influencing consumer choice. And I really come back to these questions. Why do consumers choose certain products? What factors influence our buying decisions? And that the abbreviation here that we would remember would be PEGS, psychological, economic, government, and sociocultural. Okay, that's the story for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Any questions or concerns, just put them in the comments.